So today I have on Dr. Heather Grab, an entomologist from Cornell University. Thanks for joining me.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you, Mike, and to get a chance to share with your audience.
Yes, and we were chatting quite a bit prior to hitting the record button, so I made you hold the thought. It was basically on habitat. So what we're chatting about was ultimately the high density of field edges and how that can kind of create its own problem. Something I never really actually thought about in regards to that density and sharing. Would that be vectoring diseases? Would that be the right word?
Yes. I think we had been talking a lot before we officially went live about some of the conflicts that can arise between people who really care about bees, some of whom really passionately care about honeybees in particular, and they are essential to production of specialty crops. And also they produce some really valuable and great products like honey and wax, but then there is an enormous and incredibly diverse community of different wild bee species. And occasionally, there's particular policies at play that can conflict. And I feel like, Mike, you were talking a lot about how there's a silver lining around policies that are aimed to protect honeybees and protect beekeepers and to promote healthy honeybee populations, because they can also create habitat and subsidize the creation of habitat. It can be beneficial for wild bee populations. And I had the great privilege of working with a huge array of different farmers here in New York State for a project during my PhD to evaluate how effective those diverse native perennial wildflower plantings were on an array of different farm types. So I think doing on-farm research is incredibly important for developing practices that will actually work in reality versus those that scientists, we often get really excited when we see results that worked on labs or, on research farms. But sometimes when we take those out into the real world, they don't always work the way we hope that they will. And it takes a lot of extra effort to do this kind of collaborative on-farm work with growers. But one of the benefits of it is when, something works, it's great because growers have already started implementing it on their farms. And when it doesn't work, we know, okay, great. Yeah, it's actually not really gonna work so well.
So what are the farmers doing that you're finding is successful for the pollinators?
Sure. So part of the project that we did was establishing these native perennial plantings alongside. So in my case, we were mostly working with growers who were growing June-bearing strawberry crops. They're a really high value crop. They do require pollination. They flower in the very early part of the spring. So growers do occasionally manage honeybees for strawberry pollination, but honeybees don't really like strawberries that much. They're flowering really early. They're very low to the ground. They're often also, mulched interrow with hay to try to suppress weeds. So honeybees, even when managed, make up a very small component of the overall community. And so we thought this would be a great project for evaluating how effective these wildflower plantings are for supporting a diverse native wild bee population that could then provide some services to the crops. There's a whole lot of interest in this from growers, but some of them are really worried that those wildflower plantings are going to compete against their strawberries for pollinators. And of course, they don't want that. Right. They were also worried about some of those plants becoming weeds within their cropping systems. They were worried about pests that may also be using the crop and spilling over into their planting.
So are most of them planting the perimeter around their crop?
Yeah. So a lot of them are because, they're devoting a lot of real estate to their crops. And anytime you take rows out, it complicates things, like cultivation tasks that need to be accomplished. It complicates harvest. It can create microclimates that can facilitate disease pressure in a crop environment. And so it would seem easier. And every grower that we worked with was excited to have a strip or an edge of one of their fields planted with these native perennial plants that would then flower. And strawberry is also a great crop to work in for this because it's also perennial in, at least here in the North and also in the Midwest. We plant strawberries and we don't actually start fruiting them until the next year. And growers will usually get 2, sometimes as many as 5 years of production out of a single field before yields decline so much that it's no longer worth the effort, and then they will replant. So it's great to have this perennial wildflower habitat that also takes a year to get established and get running alongside our strawberry planting. So we did that on 12 different farms. We also had control sites on the farm.
Primarily berries?
All strawberry growers in this state. Yeah. We also had some control sites that did not have a wildflower planting, so we could compare in a similar context what it would look like if there wasn't a wildflower planting around on farms. And we tracked those over 3 years to look at yields and to look at other factors like pest control, for example, and then the wild pollinator communities. And what we did find is there's kind of a Goldilocks zone in terms of the area where putting in these pollinator plantings is most effective. So putting them in farms that don't have a whole lot of natural habitat around, that are pretty high in terms of their overall ag cover around the farm, don't get much benefit from adding a wildflower planting in terms of increasing the bee population that's then visiting their strawberry crop, simply because there wasn't very many bees to recruit there anyways to begin with. Yeah. So there was not a benefit there. And we also saw that there wasn't a big benefit in putting a wildflower planting on some of our most diverse farms. So our relatively small farms that have a lot of natural cover around the farm, that are perhaps also very diverse in terms of the number of crops that they're growing on those farms. They also didn't get a big bang for the buck. And I will say, even when subsidized through programs like Conservation Reserve or EQIP, these are still very expensive plantings to get established. And there's some really cool work that's being done by economists and modelers like Eric Lonsdorf to help growers select mixes that are the most cost effective, that would still promote a diverse pollinator community. But in any regard, the mix that we used didn't work well in either the complex or the most simple farms, but it was kind of in that intermediate zone where we did see good benefit in terms of increased visitation to our crop. However, at the same time, I was really excited about this result. And I had a close friend who was starting graduate school at that time, who's now a faculty member at UMass, Dr. Laura Figueroa, who came out with me in the last years of my project, which is her first years of graduate school, to look at pathogen transmission in these wild pollinator communities. And it turns out they are chock full of disease.
Right. And that's kind of what we were mainly talking about prior to hitting the old magical record button was, tolerance versus, I guess, resistance. And tolerance would be bad. It's fine for the honeybee, but not so good for any species that it can, no pun intended, cross-pollinate diseases out with.
Yeah, exactly. And so, especially I can imagine this is not something that we looked at in this particular study, but if we are allowing pathogens to proliferate in our honeybee colonies, or this is, I think it is equally true of any bees that humans try to manage, whether it's those little cavity nesting osmia, whether it's commercial bumblebee colonies. It's not just honeybees in this case, but if we are not controlling those diseases, either by making sure that we are using stock that truly is resistant and not having a high level of prevalence of a particular pathogen, or we're not controlling it, and our stock is maybe tolerant of having a high pathogen load, when those bees forage in the environment, they may be spreading some.
So is it, I'm trying to think of, I'm not a great disease, like, knowledge beekeeper, which maybe that's a problem. But the only one that I'm aware of that's a pathogen it's nosema, right? Isn't it?
There is, yeah. So nosema. There is also, oh man, I'm not really good at my pathogens.
Yeah, we're a little off of our original topic. So I'm not prepared to talk about it. I'm sure you're not either.
Well, anyway,
which is fine.
A slew of fungal pathogens out there, including things that growers will be familiar with, like chalk brood. There's bacteria like foul brood that's out there. There's, nosema, which there's many different species of that all can infect different kinds of bees. There's viruses that are out there, blackened queen cell virus. There's deformed wing virus. These are viruses. Actually, this is probably true for nearly all of these pathogens, as we find them in not just honeybees, but also many other wild bee species.
Right. So
they are certainly out there, and especially when we create these contexts. And yeah, I mentioned before, I was so excited to see this result with the wildflower plantings, at least in some environments, being really successful at promoting pollinator populations. But at the same time, if we put those plantings in landscapes where they're suboptimal for promoting our wild pollinator populations, of course, we do still have bees there, just we're not increasing the overall number of bees. One of the things that Laura found in her work was the bees seem to be more generalist when they are interacting in these plant pollinator networks, in these habitats, in high ag landscapes. And those kinds of interactions can facilitate high pathogen prevalence even more. So it could be an extra cost to putting those in landscapes where they aren't going to work very well.
Yeah. And I feel like we've kind of cracked the can of worms on habitat and diseases that can be spread from the honeybee to native, and maybe even vice versa. But I think natives tend to take care of their house a little bit better than honeybees. But one of the things, I guess I never really did a great job of introducing you. So there was really, on Cornell's website, they have you listed as 3 primary, I don't know if they're your current studies, but one would be the agroecology, which I had to look up, which I said earlier, which I'll let you kind of explain it rather than me read what I copied and pasted off of the internet. And then,
now, if you like.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Okay. So agroecology, which I feel like is very much my home, although I've been expanding a lot. I left entomology and I now am in the School of Integrative Plant Sciences here. But either way, agroecology is very much my disciplinary home, which is simply understanding how ecological processes play out to, potentially in some cases support delivery of important services like pollination or biological pest control in managed agricultural systems. But of course, just like we were talking about, ecology is also at play in ways that can undermine the way that we manage those systems. So even if our best intention is to create these habitats to support pollination services to crops, the way we do so may actually be threatening those very services that we set out to protect. And I think a perfect example of this that, afterwards I was like, oh, duh, we pay a lot of close attention to the way that we feed other wildlife populations. So if we think about backyard bird feeders, backyard birders, they love to put out bird feeders. But of course, conservationists are very, very concerned about the way that we manage our backyard bird feeders, because they are also important points where many different species congregate and can spread pathogens. Bird bats are another great example of this. There's a couple really disgusting bird diseases of their eyes and other places that are a big problem for that. The same thing when we're thinking about managing game populations like elk. We don't feed elk populations in the winter in concentrated areas where they are managed. Sometimes we do feed them, but we're really careful about the way that we do that so that we don't spread really important pathogens like chronic wasting disease.
Right. And that's what I was going to bring up as outdoorsmen. I mean, we're just starting, well, it's been around for a while, but I feel like we're just starting to see CWD. In fact, I was just looking at the map yesterday of the country of where it is, and it's not looking good right now. And especially from a disease or a prion that can survive in nature for 7, 8, 10 years. Once it's there and spread, we're probably dealing with it forever. However, it seems like, and this was just an article I read, but it sounds like there's potentially a natural mechanism that they're starting to witness on natural populations starting to be able to deal with it a little bit. But to your point, governments are now forced to manage the hunters, because what are we doing is we want them to come to us. And so we provide a high concentration area, right, through feed or minerals or scents. And there's an argument to be made that every kind of animal, and deer I know very well, they are a bit of a social animal already. And so the real question is, would this spread? Well, we probably know it wouldn't spread as fast, but would this spread without humans versus, and would it be natural? And then there falls a whole bunch of other questions. Is that natural spreading give the animal or animals more time to deal with it too? So.
Yeah. And I think that brings it back to I think our conversation that triggered this is just the huge increase in the number of backyard beekeepers, which in many ways are no different than backyard birders who want to put up bird feeders to help support. I think we're very worried about declining songbird populations in the U.S. There's a whole lot of, I don't know, I'm from central Pennsylvania originally, so my grandparents treated white-tailed deer in the backyard like they were.
Right. Like they're their pets. Right. Right.
That's also probably very bad for chronic wasting disease. And of course, if we are doing things like that, that can absolutely act as a super spreading event for some of those diseases. And then, let's say the black-capped chickadee or the white-tailed deer, whose populations we're not so worried about right now, they seem to be doing quite well. Take those diseases, they develop tolerance to them because they're frequently interacting them, but they spread those diseases out to, populations of golden wing warblers.
Well, and how many mutations are we away from it being able to infect humans? That's also a fear, right? With some of them.
Yeah, with chronic wasting disease, for sure. That's one where humans are, we're eating a lot of venison. So there's certainly some concerns with that. With some of the other diseases, I think I'm not so worried about, like bee pathogens spilling over into humans. Bird pathogens, on the other hand, they carry a whole lot of diseases that are very much of concern to humans. Salmonella is a great example of that.
In Wisconsin, we've been dealing with the bird flu, and there's been several backyard flocks that have had to be exterminated because of it, and primarily this spring. And, I think the backyard flock, the backyard beehives, those have all been increasing since COVID because people have been stuck at home. So.
Oh, absolutely. And I will say, I absolutely empathize with this as somebody who studies this academically for my livelihood and then goes home to my own small farm where I have, I taught a course at the vet school here, a public health statistics course. My co-instructor told her all about my small farm we raise pasture pork. We have flocks of pasture poultry, turkeys, ducks, chickens. I also happen to be an avid birder, so I create and preserve a lot of migratory bird habitat on my farm for warblers. And when I told her about that, she was horrified. She was like, "You are going to be the epicenter for the next, whatever, pigs and all of these like turkeys and ducks and chickens and wild bird populations."
All crossing paths in the same spot.
But at the same time, the reason I'm doing that is because I care deeply about the ethical treatment of livestock animals. I care deeply about the conservation of biodiversity and ways that we can use our working lands to support biodiversity. But at the same time, the world is a very complicated place. And I think it hasn't changed the overall way that I manage my farm. But there's been small things that I do think about, I am much more cautious and aware about the overall health of my flock, of my livestock. Right. One, because, my livelihood depends on them, but two, because I care a lot about them. But if I have an old animal, I'm way less likely to keep that old animal on the farm for sentimental reasons. And I'm way more likely to treat any issues that come up early because of those concerns. So.
Right. And I think that there's a way to do it, right, which is responsible. I mean, I think of, I forget the guy's name, but Joe is his first name. And he's probably the United States' most famous, I don't even know how to describe it, holistic farming practice guy.
Joel Salatin.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, there's he's in a couple.
I've watched who did bee research on Polyface Farm on his farm. So
he's a guy I would love to meet too.
Yeah,
we've got a bit of a.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say she ironically, she was also doing a whole bunch of interesting bee pathogen and invasive versus.
Really? Yeah, I mean, you and I could probably totally nerd out in regards to small scale farming and how it could be one cycle and system, but that'll be the fourth podcast.
Now it's time to pay the bills, so I'm going to read you an ad. Today, this episode is brought to you by Kinnicknick Bees. It is your place to find live package and nucs for sale in the Midwest. They ship throughout primarily the entire United States. And their bees are a little bit different than the traditional package bees you get. They are mite-resistant hybrid bees. The queens are bred off of queens from Latshaw apiaries, which is known for having queens that last productively into their 5th year and without any treatments. So if you need to order bees for 2023, you could order them now or simply reserve them for as low as $20. So check them out at kinnebees.com or visit directly to the Order Honeybees page at kinnebees.com/order-honey-bees.
But yeah, it's I think that's a great example of, and he bucks a bit of the system, right? Where I think one of the documentaries I watched that he was in, he was kind of making fun of the government, saying, well, the government says I can't be butchering these chickens outside where they've been raised all day and all my stuff is clean. And to me, it's that's the way it was meant to be. And I just think as a hunter, here I am dragging my animal through dirt and God knows what else, process it, and it's totally fine. And I understand why those things are in places, but it's because I think we've industrialized the system, right? And if we pull ourselves back from the industrialization of food and kind of almost anything and everything, everything kind of starts, not everything, it starts to heal itself to some degree. And, but how do we feed the world doing that is the question, right? From a cost and from a practical standpoint.
Yeah, it's a really hard problem to solve. So,
right.
But I also think, and this is, still my naive optimism that I bring to everything, including my own farm about some things, is I'm just really happy that people, like us, who I would, I will come out of the closet as somebody who's like not a huge fan of overall of honeybees. Although,
I got that sense. That's all right.
with them. But I love that like we can have these conversations and find so much common ground there around our, like our values, and like we have a lot of the same mission that we're trying to accomplish. And, well,
and I think that that's the difference though, between like your traditional commercial beekeeping where it's all treat. All I need to do is make this hive productive for me, versus how do we strengthen the genome of the bee itself to help it ultimately survive on its own, as well as strengthening the genomes that it's spreading throughout the environment. And like we were saying, I think before we hit the record button, Tom Seeley's right there at Cornell with you, and he's kind of helped revolutionize the understanding of scaling things down, separating hives, ultimately let the bees solve their problem, and the ones that aren't, deal with them appropriately so they're not also vectoring diseases to what potentially are healthy native populations or even your healthy hives just 10 feet away. So there's kind of like a marriage there, right? And I don't think I've never liked chemicals. I don't spray chemicals in my yard. But there is a time and a place for that. And my stance on that has slowly changed little by little. Maybe it's just because I'm old and dumb now, or I'm just realizing that some things you just can't plow through with, optimism, right?
Well, I'm going to keep trying, but I'll, I think
and I'm not picking on you. I'm not saying with just optimism. I am a bit that same way. And I think that optimism is what fuels some curiosity, which solves problems.
Yeah, totally.
Because if you're not optimistic about it, you never go down an avenue that's different, right?
True. Yeah. And it's so easy also to just get caught up in like, oh, okay, well, the wildflowers, I thought they were the key, but they're not for this problem. Like everything is going to have trade-offs. There's always going to be downsides. And it is really easy to get caught up in some of those downsides. But at the same time, it's good to identify when there are things that we thought that were going to work that actually don't work. But at the same time, keeping your mind open to all of the incredible opportunities that we have available to us, like new tools that are coming into the toolkit, whether that is antimicrobial compounds that are identified from other plants or beneficial microbes, or, biological control strategies for some pathogens, or literally finding the common ground of conserving habitat in agricultural spaces that can be really good for supporting honeybee populations and also supporting wild bee populations.
Right.
So I think there's so much open area that we have to explore.
Well, there's a lot of things to navigate too. Like one of the things that as you mentioned, one of the things I thought of as you mentioned, habitat, is I'm a big proponent, like habitat. And that I think provides the biggest bang for the buck, right? But there's challenges even within the habitat. You look at, I'm not hating on the DNR, but there are states that have DNR policies that say, here's 1,000 acres, but we are native only. We can't put anything in there that's non-native, which I understand to some degree. But as you look around, there's not a spot. Well, I shouldn't say that. There's very few spots in the United States that you can go and say this is all native. Nothing has been introduced here in the last 200 years. It's difficult, if not impossible. As man moves, they move seeds and so on and so forth. But I guess my point is that having policies where it's just for native bees, where's the harm in providing, like, let's say sweet clover? Sweet clover, in my understanding, is not a native species to, let's say, Wisconsin. But it's a huge benefit to honeybees for a very long period through the year for nectar, maybe not so much pollen, but primarily nectar. And if you had that mix in with native native plantings in, let's say, 1,000-acre preserve or something, everyone wins in that situation. But if we're only gearing it of, then it becomes a bit of a desert for the honeybee. And obviously it's a honeybee show, so I have to speak on behalf of the honeybee. But I'm all for, propping up in the same effort all pollinators. Mm-hmm. And so I guess that's a really long explanation to say it's complicated.
It is very complicated. Yeah. And, one of the things that we touched on before we started recording was around, sometimes the conflict that can come up when we are trying to promote policies that support healthy pollinator populations, using the term pollinator in a really broad form here to mean both honeybees and also wild bee populations. And so part of that policy has included a lot of discussion around opening access to federal and state managed wildlife areas to beekeepers that want to pasture their bees on some of these protected lands, which isn't to say we don't allow other, farmers to graze their livestock on federal land. Certainly we do. But I think you're right about making sure that those policies are crafted in a way that's really careful. We don't, for example, allow people who are grazing cattle to graze those cattle in sensitive or protected natural areas. But we do allow, and we actively manage, in some cases, federal lands for agricultural production for other livestock. And in some cases, the way we treat honeybees really truly is like, they are a domesticated insect. We are managing them in some way. It's just a question of which philosophy we use to do so. Right.
And that's, once again, makes it complicated, right?
Yeah.
So the other two things I had on my list here was you also work on plant insect interactions. Mm-hmm. So I think we kind of touched a little bit on that. But what I really wanted to talk about was the industrial hemp production and processing, and what that interaction is with native bees and honeybees. And now that, it seems to be that, especially on the federal level, kind of easing some of the regulations, and as state by state, cannabis in general and hemp are becoming legal, and new business models are starting to pop up from that. And I don't think there's a ton of knowledge on the interaction specifically with honeybees and these plants, but you've done some research on that.
Yeah, and actually, I will say this is very much inspired by some of the work that I've been a part of, or especially that my colleagues here at Cornell have been leaders in the space of plant insect interaction. And this is not at all clear from that particular phrase, but often what we mean when we talk about plant insect interactions is how chemicals in the environment, primarily chemicals that are produced by plants, are mediating those interactions between plants and insects. And so we might think about some of the wonderful floral aromas that attract honeybees to flowers. So they're calling to the pollinators to let them know that there is a reward there. Sometimes it's a bit disingenuous. Sometimes those floral aromas are mimicking other smells, like the smell of female bees, for example. There's a whole group of orchids that smells a whole lot like female bees that are receptive and ready to mate, that attract males of that species they actually attempt to mate with the flower structure itself, and that is what transfers the pollen of that orchid to the body of those frustrated male bees then. But like my colleagues here at Cornell were very much a powerhouse in understanding that kind of work. So how insects locate their hosts using these plant compounds, how plants communicate with insects, how plants defend themselves against insects. And so it's kind of natural in terms of the transition to hemp, which has fascinating chemistry going on with it, whether we're talking about the cannabinoid molecules themselves, which are primarily located in the glandular trichomes on cannabis plants' inflorescence, but are also those glandular trichomes are broadly distributed across the plant. They just happen to be in highest density in those female inflorescences. But also things like terpenes, for example, the aroma compounds that not just cannabis has, but, if we think about cannabis's closest relative, hops. Hops is, of course, famous for its terpenes. It's what makes our IPAs so lovely. Those alpha.
Thank you, IPAs.
Yeah, exactly. Terpenolene's a great example here. Cannabis also has all of those same terpenoid compounds that play a really important role in mediating interactions, not only with insects, but also with microbes, and in some cases, even with other plants as well. So that was sort of part of my foot in the door to being really excited about working with cannabis, to be able to start to work on some of that fascinating plant chemistry, but then also to understand how it's interacting with all of the insects that are out there on farms, and especially the bees.
So this might be a silly question, but is a hemp plant the same as a cannabis plant?
So it's a really complicated question. And I will say there is so much terminology out there.
Right.
And the big reason for this is this is true with all plants, actually, and in some cases with insects too. But the plant people, especially, I feel like are always changing the names of things. So, of course, taxonomists, people that are describing new species and giving them names, follow this particular set of rules. And with most other plants, we'll go back to Linnaeus, who was, really important in naming a lot of different plant species. He named a lot of things. Sometimes he named the same plant and gave it different names because he saw it from different places or at different times. And he was actually the original, the person who put the name Cannabis sativa. He was the first one to develop, the name. He did that for a lot of things because he came up with this, nomenclatural system that we all use today. So,
which is confusing for us lay people.
Oh, it's so confusing. Yes. So then at some point later on, another very famous taxonomist came along, Lamarck. Many people will remember him for his theories about how species evolve because, let's say, a parent giraffe has to stretch its neck really tall in order to reach those high branches. And therefore, because it stretched its neck, its offspring will then adopt that trait of the parent, which turns out not to be how evolution works. In fact, he also had a lot of other problematic ideas about human evolution. But regardless, another wrong idea that he had was to describe cannabis that was primarily of Asian origin as Cannabis indica. So he came along and described it as Cannabis indica. And I will say that's not the biggest mistake he made. Lots of other taxonomists make these kinds of mistakes. Then Vavilov, another really famous plant taxonomist, came along and described a Russian origin plant as Cannabis ruderalis, very short stature plant, a plant that often flowers independent of photoperiod. And so we ended up with this kind of taxonomic soup mess. In the meantime, in the interim, humans were moving cannabis around everywhere. And there were maybe a few other names that showed up in the literature as described species. And this was happening for all the plants, though. It's not like cannabis was the only one. But the thing is, all the other plants were never subject to the same prohibition that cannabis was. And so At some point, scientists were not able to work with cannabis anymore. And many other plants went through this enormous period of revision and understanding of the true evolutionary relationships, and had names that were reassigned and things that turned out to be synonymies. So basically the same name or the same species was described with different names, and we corrected that. We went back, but because of prohibition, cannabis wasn't able to benefit from all that same discovery and scientific knowledge about it. And so what we really ended up with, especially because of, of course, yeah, sure, cannabis was illegal, but everybody, well, not everybody, a lot of people were still growing the plant, developing new cultivars, selling and buying cannabis. And because it was in this system of prohibition, there's very little good signaling about the quality of the plants that people are buying, whether that's as a cultivator who's bringing genetics online in an operation, or as somebody who's buying a plant to consume it. So a sort of terminology emerged that in some ways mirrored this earlier taxonomic description of names of having cannabis sativa, which was broadly these like European varieties that tended to be taller and used more for industrial purposes. People will tell you that they often have the narrower leaf structure. And then indicas, shorter stature, broad leaves, and ruderalis, often these short stature plants. But okay, so it turns out actually now that we've been able to apply genetic tools the same ways we do for any other plants, we've realized actually these are all the same. They're all the same species. Just one species, Cannabis sativa. There certainly has been some selection in different areas, but it's really complicated because humans have played an enormous role in shaping the current existing diversity of plants. So, people, I will say, from communities of color that have done so at very great risk to their livelihoods and their personal safety because of the prosecution that this plant has been under. So and I could just, I can't even believe it has been illegal, to be honest, but I'll leave that opinion off of the table. But what's interesting, and the reason I asked that question is I thought I kind of understood the answer. You explained it in a fashion that made me understand it a whole lot better. But recently, so we're on the border of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Minnesota recently passed a law. I don't know are you familiar with their new law? Minnesota has allowed CBD. I think Wisconsin does as well. They changed a law to allow a higher level of THC in the product, and they did it. Most of these states like Colorado, Washington, they have these very large systems and taxation mechanisms in place to benefit from them, which is good, I think. Minnesota didn't realize that. They just simply thought, and I'm paraphrasing and somewhat guessing here a little bit too, but some of the legislators didn't fully understand. They just thought, it'll just be stronger CBD oil. Well, in return, they legalized the exact same potency using, ultimately, from what their interpretation was, the same plant, and not understanding that the THC can also be grown in the same plant that the CBD is derived from. Hemp-derived cannabinoids, and or maybe it's also because I think there's an issue of hemp-derived cannabinoids. And we can definitely talk more about cannabinoids generally, but also around some of the isomers. So like Delta-8, for example, which is broadly available, not actually legal per se. Some states have explicitly made that legal. And right now that's going, like the debate about where we draw the line on that is currently being worked out in the courts in several different states. And
Yeah. And so in Minnesota's case, it was Delta-9 that they didn't realize that they were approving.
Yes. And so probably that's because
So anybody can sell ultimately Delta-9 gummies in Minnesota now without any special taxation, any special rules.
Which honestly, I would argue, and I think, I'm on maybe the far end of the spectrum here, but as somebody who's spent a lot of time thinking about these things, I would argue that I think we probably should be taking a much more liberal approach to the way we regulate our cannabis industry. But before we get there, we should take 10.5 steps back to the beginning. Cause I think we got
Right.
part of things that like everything is cannabis sativa, but in the same way that, broccoli, kale, kohlrabi, I don't know who eats that stuff, but some people, I guess.
I've never had it.
We selected one species, brassica. I'm going to say it's an apis. I could be wrong. Brassica, there's one single species that we selected that produces kale, so selected for the leaves. Kohlrabi, again, who eats that? It's the stem. Gross. Selected for the stem.
It's where it's bitter.
Broccoli, selected for those inflorescences
Fruit,
in there. That's all the same species, and it's exactly the same thing for hemp and cannabis generally. We have plants that have been selected for high production of female inflorescences. Really big, large female flowers are dedicating a huge proportion of their resources to that. We also have plants, for those who are watching us on the YouTube stream, there's one behind me in my office here that's just shy of 17 feet tall.
Holy cow.
Fiber production, so producing rope, producing textiles, producing green building technologies. There's a whole bunch of applications for the stem and the fibers of the plant. And we also have grain cultivars that tend to be short in stature, that are producing the seed of the plant themselves. Are selected for seed production to produce plants that have really optimal omega-3 to omega-6 fatty acid ratios, that have a whole bunch of different essential amino acids that we can't find in other places. So it's just like that in terms of the way that we've taken this one single species and selected for these very different market classes.
Right.
And within the high cannabinoid market class, it's actually really, it's essentially a Mendelian trait. It's not as simple as being just one gene. But for, like in a Mendelian trait system, we have dominant and recessive traits. And so if a plant has two high THC alleles, essentially, it's not really that, but it's close enough, it will produce THC predominantly. If a plant has a THC and a CBD allele, it'll produce an even ratio of those two different compounds. They come from the same parent cannabinoid compound, CBG. And if a plant has two copies of CBD, it will produce almost entirely CBD. The problem for our hemp growers, though, is that the enzyme, so there's two primary enzymes that I'm talking about here, THCA synthase, so that produces THC, delta 9 THC, or CBDA synthase, which produces CBD. There's also CBCA synthase, and there may be a couple other versions of this that do cool things. Cannabinoids are awesome. But those are the two primary ones, THC and CBD. The problem, though, is that CBDA synthase, so even if you have two copies of it, you should only be producing CBDA, right? No, this enzyme is a little promiscuous. And about 1 in 24 times, it will also produce a THCA molecule. So same parent compound, CBGA, even if you have your, homozygous, so you have two copies of CBDA synthase, you should only be producing CBDA synthase. You still occasionally can build up THCA. So even hemp plants that's a reason why they might go above that 0.3% by weight THC threshold, even if they're genetically going to be producing CBD. The other,
which is probably the loophole that Minnesota fell into.
It's almost the loophole because people are freaking smart especially when they're incentivized by markets. So, they were like, oh, awesome. Even with CBD, the difference between the CBD molecule and the THC molecule is not large. It's not that big. And in fact, you can isomerize your CBD into delta 8 THC. It's the most common one. And people often are looking for that because I guess with the exception of Minnesota, everywhere else, the Delta 8 THC is like pseudo legal, in New York State here, they are like, no, Delta 8, you can still buy it everywhere. I can go to the gas station, I can go wherever.
New York has legalized cannabis, hasn't it?
New York recently passed the MRTA, Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act, finally, yay, which allows us to develop an industry for recreational adult use cannabis, so plants with more than 0.3% THC in them, which is awesome. There's a ton of really great regulation that's included in that overall legislation. So things that prevent really large corporations from coming in and dominating the market.
Nice. That's good.
So the license structure is such that people can only participate in certain segments of the industry. So you could only grow, only process, only retail, only deliver, it's divided up in a way that makes there be many more slices of the pie for everybody.
That's
and
nice.
The way that they're distributing all those slices of the pie is in a manner that helps to rectify some of the past harm from the war on drugs. So social equity applicants are getting a lot of support in terms of their access to capital, their access to mentorship to be successful in the industry, and then also priority consideration in terms of their access to licenses.
Now, hopefully that just spreads west.
I do hope so. And I think a lot of states have recognized that, in the way that they developed their industry. So Colorado is a great example of a state that has recently revised some of the policies in their industry, especially around addressing some of the past harm. So of course, communities of color have been disproportionately penalized for their interaction with cannabis in the justice system. So, people of color and white people use cannabis at equal rates. We know that from a whole bunch of use studies, and yet people of color are way more likely to be incarcerated for cannabis related offenses than white people are. And so at the same time, we legalize this industry without expunging the records in many cases of people who had been justice impacted, and also people who benefited from, having access to federal grants for college, for example, or, a lot of existing wealth were able to really quickly come in and capitalize on this new market and make a ton of money off of it, which kind of in some ways further compounds the injustice of the entire market. And states have recognized that. And they've started to amend their policies. So Colorado is a great example of that. California, in terms of the way that crop is taxed in California, legal cannabis generates enormous revenue.
I know it absolutely does. And I think that's where, Minnesota kind of missed a bit of an opportunity, and hopefully they can go back and revise something, but at the end of the day, I'm happy.
Yes, whether they use it or not, I don't know.
Right.
But it does. In states where they have created these tax structures, it does generate a huge amount of revenue. However, the way that those systems are structured can prevent people who are already operating in the unregulated market from wanting to participate in this new regulated market. So thinking really carefully about the way we set up those tax structures and the way that we support people coming from the unregulated market and bringing them, into this new market is going to be, it's important for if they want this to be a revenue generator, they need to address that issue overall. And that's been something that California has historically struggled a lot with. Their illegal cannabis market is probably just as large, if not larger, than the size of their legal cannabis market, which means, one, some of the practices that are used in California because of the very limited water resources that threaten natural habitats there are continuing to go on. And two, California is not generating revenue from people who are operating in that unregulated market. So I would say also regulated markets are equally at fault for some of the poor environmental practices. So again, not to call out names, but Colorado is an example of a state. There are many others that, because of the stigma around cannabis, require cannabis to be cultivated indoors. This is not an environmentally friendly way to grow plants.
Right. Well, and you just think of the energy alone that it takes. I mean,
yes. Yeah. And a lot of people think that's, that has to do with lights. And we've made huge advances in our lighting technologies, moving towards LEDs. But a huge portion of the overall carbon footprint of indoor cultivation facilities comes from the HVAC systems. So making sure that they are cooling the air to the appropriate temperature and handling the huge moisture load that's coming off of those plants when they are photosynthesizing and evapotranspirating water into the air. It takes a lot of power to operate those facilities, which is not and they're very reliant on synthetic inputs as well. So in New York State, we have actually, the policy right now, which is maybe not ideal, is pushed a lot of growers to outdoor cultivation, which I think is fantastic. And grain and fiber hemp, obviously, you're only ever going to be growing those outdoors. And
well, if they grow 17 feet tall, it's like quite the tall
I'm not sure that we need them to grow 17 feet tall per se, but they can for sure do that. So, but those will be grown in traditional field crop production systems outdoors. So.
Nice. So I'm trying to look at my list here. So as you were researching first, maybe we should answer this question. So does hemp or cannabis, does it generate both nectar and pollen?
So cannabis, which is like, I would say so it's the genus, and it actually is just the one species that lives within that genus, Cannabis sativa.
So what word should I be using instead?
Colloquially, I would say cannabis could be used for like what we mean when we mean like high THC or high cannabinoid plants.
Okay.
Like that's just the language that people are familiar with there. And then,
so what should I refer to them as?
Oh, I don't know. I feel like
should I just say hemp or cannabis?
What I try to use is like high cannabinoid, if I mean like plants that are grown for cannabinoids. And then high THC cannabis, or if I mean like adult use or recreational, it's high THC. And then I usually will use the term hemp, but because of all the legal sensitivities around this, like you can grow high cannabinoid hemp. And a lot of people are very sensitive about the use of that term, like particularly Cornell, very sensitive about it because we're a federally funded institution. So we have greenhouses full of like beautiful, beautiful, beautiful plants, field trials full of gorgeous high cannabinoid plants, but they're very, very clear that we are only growing hemp. So the only difference between those is whether it possesses the genetic structure to produce those individual enzymes. There's nothing else different between those plants. It's just those enzymes that are in there, whether they're converting that CBG molecule into THC or whether they're converting it into CBD and then sometimes occasionally a little bit of THC. But we grow only high cannabinoid hemp here. Well, and regular hemp, grain and fiber.
So in the study that you did in regards to pollinators, it was just hemp?
Yes.
Okay.
It was just hemp. And to answer your earlier question, high cannabinoid hemp in this case is producing neither nectar or ideally and especially not pollen. So growers who are trying to produce high cannabinoid hemp, whether that's high THC or high CBD, do not want pollen around. The reason for that is because, well, one, if you are trying to produce a smokable product, nobody likes seeds in there. And two, when the plant is pollinated, it reduces its overall investment into those glandular trichomes I mentioned earlier and starts to transition some resources into developing and maturing the grain that's in there.
And so that's the flower of the plant, correct?
Yeah. So that's those female inflorescences of those high cannabinoid plants. And actually most growers will use clones of mother plants that are female, or they will use feminized seed in their production. So high cannabinoid, whether it's high THC, high CBD, or, there's even cases, there's plants that don't produce either of those. They produce only CBG. Any of those should have zero resources for bees because they're not producing nectar and they're not producing pollen. It's really the industrial hemp plants that is where, like all the magic is happening for bees. Hemp is wind pollinated. It's naturally dioecious, meaning that there are separate male and female plants. There are a few cultivars that have been selected for monoecious, which means there's both male and female plants or flowers on the same plant there. But either way, the female flowers are never producing nectar. They are producing copious amounts of pollen, like tons of pollen.
Oh, really?
Because they are wind pollinated. And so most wind pollinated plants are producing a whole lot of pollen in order to make sure that the female inflorescences that may be, a mile away are able to get pollinated. So
when people advertise, I haven't seen it very often, but I've seen some honeys, for instance, that they claim is CBD or THC honey. I'm assuming then at that point, that's just infused.
So pollen itself actually does have cannabinoids in it, but not much. And when bees visit when bees visit hemp fields and they're collecting hemp pollen, they're bringing that back to the hive, and it does show up in hive products. It was a really great study. I believe it was funded by the Sustainable Agricultural Research and Extension Program that is operated by the USDA, one of their farmer research programs, where a farmer out in Colorado that was starting to grow a ton of hemp and also had an apiary wanted to see what would happen if his bees had access to these hemp fields. And they did indeed bring back, a whole bunch of pollen from hemp. And he did see high levels of CBD. And by high, I mean, they were in there, they were showing up, they were detectable levels in the wax, in the propolis, and in the honey. But the problem is because hemp does not produce any nectar. And you can imagine out in Colorado in the dry season in the summer, there's not a whole lot of other nectar resources out there. So he actually had to end his study early because the bees didn't have enough nectar. They were doing very poorly. So cannabinoids will show up in your hive products, which beekeepers should be aware of because those cannabinoids are regulated compounds.
Right. And so someone that isn't aware of that, if they were to ingest that honey and, for instance, were drug tested, there's a chance that they would test positive for something they weren't even quite sure that they ingested?
That's a really good question because to put this in perspective, they are in there and they are a regulated compound at any level. States regulate them. And the FDA does not allow CBD at any level in food products, which, people are doing it anyways, but still it's not allowed. So if people are thinking about managing their potential risk down the line, if you've got a customer, they might make a claim and, they can test your honey, they can test your propolis, they can test your wax, and there are detectable levels of cannabinoids in there. So it's something that apiaries should be thinking about and managing their risk. But luckily, the risk is very low.
Okay.
You would need to consume over a ton of honey in order to get 100 milligram dose of CBD.
I think you'd die of honey ingestion before you'd get yourself in trouble.
You would absolutely die from eating that much honey. But when bees are in areas where there are hemp fields, they will definitely go forage on that hemp. And they'll bring it back to the hive, and those compounds will be in the hive products. So levels, but
do we know if that pollen from the hemp plant, if that is a good source of nutrients for the bees? And if so, like, do we know, like, is it a high protein versus, their typical other foraging pollens?
I've been super curious about this because as soon as growers here in New York State started planting hemp, when it was allowed under the 2014 Farm Bill program, so even before it was removed from the scheduling system that the DEA runs, so for a while, it was still considered a Schedule 1 drug. And I will say high THC cannabis still is considered a Schedule 1 drug, even though compounds like fentanyl are lower on the
let's not even get into that. I get angry talking about that.
Well, anyway, so our growers here that were participating in our early program that allowed farmers to get licenses through this research program in collaboration with institutions of higher education like Cornell, one of the first things that they reported back to us after growing them was, there are a lot of bees out here. What are all these bees doing? Why are they here? And I was also very curious about this. And our research team lead here at Cornell, Dr. Larry Smart, who was coordinating all of this research with our grower partners, recruited me and one of my students at the time, he was an undergraduate, Nate Flicker, to do a study and figure out, like, who are all these bees? What causes them to be really abundant on some farms and less abundant on other farms? And why might they like this hemp so much more than some of the other things that are out there? And I think one of the big things that leads to there being really large populations of bees on hemp, mostly honeybees, about 60% of all the bees that Nate and I collected on hemp farms were honeybees. Another 30% of that was then the common eastern bumblebee. And the rest was a slew of different other small native pollinators, things that you might look at and originally think, like, that's not a bee, that's an ant with wings, but it is in fact a bee. So some little sweat bees and other things that were.
Well, that's what that in my notes here, and I'm sure you're probably looking at them, that's what really popped out to me was that study that was published. I don't have it in front of me, so I don't remember the name of it, but you guys had listed off the species count, and it was Apis was 210 visits. The bumblebee was 105. And then, sweat bee was 11. And then it went 5, 4, 4, 3, 2, 2, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. But it was pretty clear that the honeybees loved it.
Honeybees loved it, which I think partially it was cool to see so many social bees in there. And I think part of that is because they are able to use these recruitment-based foraging strategies. But I would say, like bumblebees are not doing that. They're also social, but they are incredibly curious creatures. I would also say that honeybees are as well. They're really adaptable and quick to learn. If you see a male hemp plant, it does not have showy flowers. They are, like small green. I would say they're understated in their beauty. If you look at them really up close, they are quite pretty. But they're not a flower that you would look at and be like, oh yeah, that's a flower that's producing a ton of pollen.
Right.
But bees figured that out. And I think a huge reason why honeybees did is because of their ability to find, have one individual that identifies that rewarding resource and then recruits so many other bees out there to that resource.
Well, I wonder if it's similar to like ragweed. I mean, I didn't recognize that ragweed even had flowers until I had bees. And I remember walking my chicken run, which is just littered with ragweed. And I'm like, what is buzzing? I don't see a single flower. And I look down and here's these bees hanging onto the bottom side of the flower, and I'd shake it and you could just see all the pollen fall out. And it's like I kind of came to two realizations at that point. A, I see why people have problems with pollen from ragweed because it has a lot. And two, it has flowers, but they're all pointing straight down and they're tiny. So you can't really see them unless you're laying on your back.
Yeah, but bees are just crazy smart creatures. And these wind pollinated plants like ragweed and hemp are producing enormous amounts of pollen. There's a study that was done. It was published in 2001, so it was probably done in the late 90s in the Midwest, looking at aerial pollen loads. Cannabis in general, who knows from what, because this was way before there were any legal programs out there, was, I want to say, over 30% of the overall aerial pollen that they found in the Midwest. And this was a study that was published in 2001. Wow. So you can only imagine what it is now. That we have actual like huge acreage of fiber and grain production in the Midwest. Historically, that was a place where we were growing the majority of our industrial hemp in the US. And it's certainly a place where we're going to continue to see a lot of investment and production of industrial hemp. So there's a ton of hemp pollen out there in the air. But bees are really adaptable. They're very resourceful. And you, as a beekeeper, will probably appreciate the fact that there is a period in the midsummer before things like ragweed and goldenrod and other fall flowers come online. And after our spring flush of resources and even other wind pollinated things like trees are producing a lot of pollen in the spring, there's this like midsummer dearth of resources. Yeah. It's like a dip in the availability of other resources, but that is the exact point when hemp is coming online. So that July
kind of helps modulate the available pollen in the area, which is great. I mean, beekeepers would love to hear that.
Yeah. So hemp really helps to fill that gap. And I think that's one reason why we see so much bee activity on it, is because it's flowering at a period of time when there aren't as many other resources available. So I think, we talked a little bit earlier about some of the work I did on strawberry, and people are bringing bees into strawberry, especially because you can get some really nice strawberry honey if you can get your bees foraging on those strawberries. But it's so hard to get the honeybees to forage on strawberry because it's blooming in the spring. And there's so much else out there for the bees in, like forest habitats and old fields. There's so much going on for them that they're like, oh, strawberry pass, I'll go somewhere else. But for hemp, there's not much else out when hemp is flowering, and it fills that really important gap for resources. But the critical thing, again, going back to what is it providing? It's providing a ton of pollen, but it's not providing any nectar. So, well, at that point, I mean, the hive should have a fair amount of nectar / honey resources in it. And what'll help is having that protein from the pollen come in, as they'll activate their brood rearing, hopefully, which will give them that last final push as that very strong fall flow comes on. And so it could play a very pivotal role in honey production. Yeah. And I think protein, that's a really important component. So a lot of wind pollinated plants, because they're producing enormous amounts of pollen, tend not to have the most protein rich pollen compared to, like, if we think, for example, of plants that really are very stingy about their pollen, maybe they're like tomato or blueberry that have these poricidal anthers that need to be vibrated at the right frequency to release their pollen. They tend to have very rewarding pollen in terms of the protein content. And we don't know a ton about the protein content of hemp pollen. So I was trying, and there's a couple of studies that are out there. Some of them, do that weird thing in science where the one study cites the other study. That's just study citing some other study. And sometimes the numbers are a little different between those. There's also been a little bit of work done in the allergy community as well, because people are very worried about, hemp pollen as an environmental allergen. So they're really interested in the protein composition. But in that case, those studies have mostly focused on specific protein composition. So what kinds of proteins are there in there that could be allergenic, and not the overall nutritional profile in terms of the protein of pollen. So I've seen estimates that range anywhere from 3% to 30%.
Wow.
But I would love
30% seems very high. I mean,
30% does seem very high. That would be in the range of things like tomato or blueberry, some of those other crops that are really holding on to their pollens.
So would the plants, well, this maybe will bridge into the next question I have, but is the height of the plant, for instance, you've that beautiful 17-footer behind you, would that produce a lower content of pollen? Because I'm guessing that it would produce a lot more pollen versus one that's maybe a little more slow growing and likely produces less, which therefore I would imagine would be a slower growing process.
This is an excellent question. I had not considered that perspective, and now I'm very interested to think about that, or at least from what we know about how plant architectural and growth traits relate to pollen nutritional composition. But I was also very curious to know. And so what I and some of my my pollinator research friends here at Cornell did last year, what we really wanted to do was collect pure pollen from a whole bunch of different cultivars, some cultivars that were short, some cultivars that were tall. One thing that Nate and I found in our study is that the bees actually seem to prefer, we saw highest abundance of bees on farms where they were growing some of these taller fiber cultivars, in contrast to some of those shorter grain cultivars. And we didn't know, maybe it's just that it's easier for these bees to run into by accident these really big, tall plants and then discover that they do have this pollen resource compared to a shorter plant they might fly over, for example.
When you answered my question without even me having to ask it, that was going to be the next one.
That we noticed that was counter, but we were still these cultivars. The one, the 17-footer that's behind me was, that cultivar was developed in Asia. We have cultivars that have been developed in Northern Europe, in South Africa, in Australia, here in North America. These are plants with incredible genetic diversity and differences between them, even though they are the same, they're all the same species. So there may really be very real differences in the amount of pollen or the amount of protein in their pollen. For example, grain cultivars, we see huge differences in the amount of protein that different cultivars have in their grain. So my research friends and I here at Cornell went out, and what we ended up doing, because we were not very good at collecting pollen ourselves from the plants, was to collect that pollen from bees that were foraging on plots of different cultivars of the plant. And we do have that pollen stored away so that at some point here, when we have time over the winter, we'll be able to do some nutritional analysis and see what are the pollen loads, what do the proteins look like in them? Are there other cool molecules that are showing up that are different across different cultivars? So
it'd be interesting to know.
A lot of pollen from bees. It was pretty fun. We only got stung a few times. So.
Well, that's good. So we are rolling into we've been talking almost 2 hours, but we've been recorded, I think, for about an hour and a half. So I just try to kind of wrap it up a little bit, as much as I don't want to, but I have a child I have to go pick up from daycare. So are there, I mean, it sounds like the plants themselves ultimately kind of take care of themselves, being that they are, wind pollinated. But is there, anything in your mind that like beekeepers could bridge over into the hemp and cannabis market other than like infused honey with THC?
I mean, the reason why you see it out there is because people consumers like it.
Right.
Cannabinoids, though, are highly lipophilic compounds. So what that means from the beekeeper perspective is that they are going to show up in the highest concentration in things like waxes. So they really love attaching to those fatty, waxy compounds, which means, on the contrast, it's kind of hard to get them into and evenly distributed within something like honey, which doesn't have a whole lot of fats in it, which is great. So there are technologies that do allow people to do that. But I would say from the beekeeper's perspective, there may be some really important roles for some of those compounds that are in the plant. So of course, it's great to have this as a pollen resource that's out there. Certainly something that beekeepers may want to think about in managing their risk, but there could also be benefits for the bees that might be another additional reason why they're collecting it. So we do know that all insects, so not just bees, but I think actually maybe it's all arthropods, can't remember, lack the same endocannabinoid receptors that we have. So they're probably not having any, like neurological or behavioral effects from ingesting these cannabinoids. In any regard, the cannabinoids that are produced in the plants are in the acidic form, which even for us with our endocannabinoid system is the non-psychoactive form. That's why we need to smoke the plant or cook it and bake it into something, apply heat that decarboxylates the molecules. It turns that acidic form, it's a carboxylic acid that's on that molecule, releases that carboxylic acid as CO2, converts it into the neutral form, which is in the case of.
So is that what they describe as like the butter? Like that is the process of heating it?
So if you make an infused oil, if you infuse at a high temperature, that could be sufficient to initiate that decarboxylation reaction.
Interesting.
But a lot of time what people will do is they will just heat the flower before they do an infusion. You can also just buy decarboxylated isolates of all of these compounds and put those into your honeys as well. But cannabinoids themselves are antimicrobial. They also, recently there's been a lot of news and research about their antiviral activity as well, especially in the acidic form that we find them in plants. And there's terpenes in there as well.
Well, I mean, I think that would be great for hive health. When you think of propolis, I mean, that's what propolis has been hypothesized. Its function within the hive is to.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Interesting.
So what I would love to know is part of the reason why we might see differences across cultivars. Maybe it is things like height, maybe it is things like protein content, but maybe another part of the story about why bees are so attracted to collecting pollen from hemp plants, maybe because they are getting some benefit from having those cannabinoids and those terpene molecules in the hive. And they may be, that may be helpful for them in dealing with things like chalk brood or foul brood or nosema, for example. But we don't know. So it would be really cool to find out.
Well, it makes me think like, if you're saying like, even in areas that don't have hemp legalized, that it's still, is in the environment in a high percentage. To me, that shows that maybe nature has it there for a reason in such high quantities. And maybe it's a little bit of a piece that a beehive is missing in overall hive health as well. I'm just totally a guess, right? But nature seems to always kind of point us in the right direction.
Well, in this case, it could have been, humans cultivating cannabis illicitly.
But I mean, honestly, at that high of a percentage, I mean, there'd be a lot of people doing it, wouldn't it?
Oh yeah, but there are a lot of people doing it.
That's
Probably
true.
aren't telling anybody about it because it's illegal. But I will also say the Midwest has recently been one of the best regions for identifying feral hemp cultivars that escaped human cultivation and that we're now incorporating back into our genetic conservation programs. The USDA just established their germplasm collection for hemp here at Cornell at our agritech campus in Geneva, New York. And so they've, the folks there have been going out across the country and will hopefully be able to go out across the world and work with our, partners in different countries to help conserve some of the really unique resources that are out there that could have even higher concentrations of some of those molecules that might have promising action against things like, varroa mite, for example.
Well, and I have heard that at one point in time, Wisconsin was one of the leading hemp producing states. And even to this day, I mean, you go out, just walking around the woods or whatever, and you'll find a plant here, a plant there that seem to have no reason to be there. I mean, there was an old house that we used to live in, and we're on the edge. I mean, we're pretty much in the middle of industrial agriculture, and there was a ditch just full of it. I mean, no reason to be there. I mean, I couldn't imagine someone growing it there illegally on purpose, The
colloquial name for feral hemp is ditchweed.
Yeah, it was ditchweed.
Yeah, people have it is there. It is surviving, certainly. But that sort of led to a misconception about how easy it is to grow successfully hemp and cannabis at scale. So a lot of people were like, oh, it survives everywhere. It survives in ditches. But it turns out it's actually really hard to successfully grow hemp and cannabis. Not that our, farmers and cultivators in the U.S. have not been doing so for a really long time, and they've been up to the challenge, but it wasn't as easy as ditchweed might lead you to believe. So
Well, that is probably a great spot to end it. Is there any resources you want to point people to in regards to checking out more of your work or any of your social media following?
Sure. Yeah, I'm always happy to talk to anybody who wants to talk to me about hemp or about bees. You can, of course, find me at my Cornell page just by searching Heather Grab and the word Cornell, probably. You can also email me, Heather Grab, all one word, at cornell.edu directly, and find me on Instagram, heather.grab, or my website that covers not just my research stuff, but also my small farm. There's a lot of photos of past projects there, including our wildflower project, and some of the hemp work that we were doing at landscape-agroecology.com.
Awesome. And we'll include all those links below. So anyone interested in it that didn't write it down, they can just visit there and check it out.
Perfect.
Well, thank you so much. Appreciate it. And I think that we might have to schedule a couple others because I have a feeling we could talk for a long time about a couple other things.
Awesome. It would be a treat to come back. It's been a pleasure to be here to talk with you. Even across our differences in terms of our passion for wild bees versus honeybees. So love to continue that conversation.
All right. Well, thank you.
Left to say how to get up, walk away, know when to hold them, know when to fold, know when to hold them, know when to fold.